When I first met Margaret Collins, she was 67 years old and had just retired from her career as a high school English teacher. Margaret had always been the kind of woman who enjoyed tending to her rose garden in the early morning, baking bread for her grandchildren on weekends, and taking peaceful walks through the neighborhood with her husband. But over the past year, something had quietly crept into her life, something she couldn't quite put her finger on at first. She noticed it one chilly autumn morning when she tried to carry 2 grocery bags from her car into the house. Halfway to the front door, her arms trembled, her legs felt unsteady, and she had to set the bags down to catch her breath. It wasn't like her. This simple task, something she had done thousands of times before, suddenly felt like climbing a hill. At first, Margaret brushed it off as just getting older. She even laughed about it with her husband, saying, "Guess I'm not 30 anymore." But as the weeks went by, more little moments began to trouble her. Climbing the stairs felt harder. Reaching for a box on the top shelf took more effort. Even walking around the block with her dog left her legs feeling strangely heavy. There was no dramatic pain, no injury to point to, just a slow, invisible fading of her strength. That's when concern began to replace her laughter. She had always prided herself on being independent, on never having to rely on anyone for daily tasks. But now, for the first time, she wondered if that independence might slip away sooner than she'd ever imagined. One afternoon, during her routine checkup, Margaret mentioned these changes to her doctor. After a short discussion and a few physical strength tests, her doctor gave her a term she had never heard before: sarcopenia, the gradual loss of muscle mass and strength as we age. The word sounded almost too technical to be dangerous, but the doctor's tone was serious. "It's more common than people think," he explained, "and if you ignore it, it can lead to falls, fractures, and a much faster loss of independence." Margaret sat quietly, absorbing every word. She'd thought of aging as a slow, gentle decline, but here was a very specific, very real condition that could rob her of the life she wanted to live. And it wasn't something far off in the future, it was happening to her right now. That night, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought about her mother, who had needed a cane by 70 and a walker not long after. She remembered how her mother's world had slowly shrunk to the distance between her armchair and the kitchen table. Margaret didn't want that for herself. She wanted to keep baking for her grandchildren, traveling with her friends, and working in her beloved garden. But the fear was real. If she was already struggling now, what would the next 5 years look like? She felt a mix of frustration, worry, and determination, because if there was even a chance she could slow this process down, she wanted to know how. The next morning, Margaret began her search for answers. She read articles, watched videos, and spoke with friends who were active in their 70s. She quickly learned that exercise was important, but there was something else that kept coming up over and over again: protein. Not just eat more protein, but the idea that as we get older, our bodies actually become less efficient at using it. That meant she needed more high-quality protein, not less. The trouble was, like many people, Margaret assumed that eating an egg or 2 each day was enough. After all, eggs had always been called nature's perfect protein. But as she dug deeper, she discovered a surprising truth. There were other foods, some sitting right in her pantry, that not only had more protein than eggs, but were better suited for maintaining muscle and strength in seniors. Still, Margaret was skeptical. How could anything beat eggs? She had eaten them her entire life, scrambled, boiled, poached. But the more she read, the more it made sense. While eggs were certainly good, they weren't unbeatable. And when she looked at her daily diet, she realized it was heavy on toast, cereal, and light lunches, not exactly a protein powerhouse. This was the quiet trap so many people over 60 fall into. They think they're eating enough, but in reality, their meals lack the very building blocks their bodies need to fight muscle loss. Margaret now understood that if she didn't change her habits, her decline would continue. That was the turning point. She decided to treat her meals as more than just food. They would become tools for her independence. She started small. At the market, she picked up foods she'd never thought of as muscle builders, guided by the simple rule: more protein, higher quality. She remembered her doctor saying, "It's not about eating more food, it's about eating the right food." That advice stuck with her. Within a couple of weeks, Margaret noticed subtle but promising changes. Carrying groceries felt easier. Her legs didn't tire so quickly during walks. She could stand from her favorite armchair without pushing off the armrest. And with each little victory, her confidence grew. She began experimenting with recipes, combining different protein-rich foods with colorful vegetables, adding small but impactful changes to each meal. Her husband joined in, enjoying the meals just as much, and together they discovered new favorites that kept their plates interesting and satisfying. But what struck Margaret most was the feeling of control returning to her life. She no longer felt like a passive passenger on the journey of aging. Instead, she felt like the driver, making deliberate choices that would shape how well she could live in the years ahead. And that feeling, more than anything, made her realize that her efforts were not just about avoiding weakness, they were about preserving freedom. Today, Margaret still eats eggs, but she no longer sees them as the sole answer to her protein needs. She has learned which foods give her the most strength for the least effort, and how to prepare them so they work with her body, not against it. Her story isn't about quick fixes or miracle cures. It's about understanding the quiet changes happening inside her body and meeting them head-on with simple, smart nutrition. That's why, in this video, I want to take you through the exact foods that helped Margaret reclaim her strength. Foods that have more protein than eggs, are easy to digest, and can keep you strong, steady, and independent no matter your age. Because Margaret's journey could be yours, and just like her, you don't have to wait for weakness to take over before you act. The knowledge you gain today might be the reason you stay active and vibrant for many more years to come. Margaret woke up early that morning, sunlight slipping through the curtains, and sat on the edge of her bed for a moment before standing. As she rose, she noticed her legs felt heavier than they used to, her knees stiff in a way that made her move slower toward the kitchen. She brushed it off, thinking, "It's just because I'm not as young anymore." But as she reached for the kettle and poured herself a cup of tea, she realized that same heaviness had been creeping in for weeks, maybe even months. It wasn't sharp pain, more like a quiet, stubborn resistance in her body that seemed to whisper, "You can't do what you used to." The first time it truly caught her attention was when she went to the supermarket alone. She'd only planned to buy a few things, bread, milk, some vegetables, but ended up with 2 full bags. As she carried them to the car, she had to stop halfway, her arms trembling and her breathing quickening. Margaret leaned against the side of the car, embarrassed and frustrated. She thought back to years earlier when she could manage twice that weight without a second thought. The change hadn't been sudden, it was slow, sneaky, and easy to ignore, until moments like this made it impossible to deny. Later that day, she mentioned it casually to her daughter Emily over the phone. Emily laughed softly and said, "Mom, that's just what happens when we get older." Margaret laughed along, but deep inside, she didn't believe that was the whole story. She'd seen women in their 70s and even 80s walking briskly in the park, carrying groceries, tending to gardens. Was she really so different, or was there something she was missing? That quiet question stayed with her for days. One Sunday afternoon, she met her neighbor, Mrs. Patel, while pruning her roses. Mrs. Patel, in her early 70s, was bending and stretching with surprising ease. They chatted about the weather, the flowers, and eventually about staying active. Margaret admitted almost reluctantly, "I've been feeling weaker lately, even with small tasks." Mrs. Patel tilted her head and said, "It's not always just age, dear. Sometimes it's what we feed our muscles, or don't." That small remark struck Margaret more deeply than she expected. It was the first time she'd really considered that her body's strength depended on more than simply staying active. She began to recall moments from her teaching days when she'd stand for hours in front of a classroom without fatigue, or the summer afternoons she'd spend weeding her garden under the sun without feeling sore the next day. The contrast to her present reality was startling. She had to know what had changed, and more importantly, if it could be reversed. The following week, she booked her annual checkup with Dr. Reynolds, her longtime family doctor. During the visit, she explained what she'd been experiencing. Dr. Reynolds listened carefully, nodding. "Margaret, what you're describing could be related to something we call sarcopenia. It's common after 60, but not inevitable. It's the gradual loss of muscle mass and strength." He leaned forward slightly. Many people think it's just aging, but diet and activity play a much bigger role than most realize. You still have time to slow it down, even improve your strength, but you'll need to make a few changes. Those words were both comforting and challenging. Comforting because it meant she wasn't doomed to get weaker with every passing year. Challenging because it meant the responsibility to change was hers. Margaret left the clinic that day feeling determined, but also a little overwhelmed. Where should she start? Exercise, supplements, diet? She had tried various fitness routines before but never stuck with them. And she'd always believed her diet was good enough. Now she wasn't so sure. That evening, over dinner with her husband Richard, she shared what the doctor had said. Richard listened, nodding, and then simply said, "If anyone can turn this around, it's you." It was exactly the encouragement she needed. She decided that instead of blaming age, she would treat this as a challenge, a project even. Margaret had always been good at solving problems methodically, and this time the problem was her own well-being. Over the next few days, she began paying closer attention to her habits. She realized her breakfasts were often just toast and tea. Lunch might be a small sandwich, and dinner, while balanced, wasn't always rich in the kind of nutrients her muscles craved. No wonder her body felt like it was running on low fuel. She thought about what Mrs. Patel had said and what Dr. Reynolds had confirmed. Her muscles needed to be fed just as much as they needed to be moved. This realization was a turning point. For the first time in months, Margaret felt a spark of hope. She understood that weakness after 60 wasn't always a sentence written in stone. It could be a warning sign, one that could be answered with the right action. She didn't yet know exactly which foods would help most, but she was ready to find out. And she knew that once she did, she would commit to making them part of her life, not just for a few weeks, but for as long as she wanted to keep walking her dog, carrying her groceries, and tending to her roses without stopping to rest. Margaret didn't need long to realize that what Dr. Reynolds had called sarcopenia wasn't some distant academic concept. It was already moving quietly through her life. It wasn't dramatic like breaking a bone or catching the flu. Instead, it worked in whispers, taking away just enough strength that she noticed only when a familiar task suddenly felt heavier, slower, or more tiring than it used to. That's what made it so dangerous. Its stealth. She thought back over the past year and could see now that it had been creeping in all along, right under her nose. One afternoon, while dusting the shelves in her living room, Margaret decided to move a box of family photo albums to the coffee table so she could look through them. She had lifted that box countless times over the years. But this time, as she picked it up, her arms trembled almost immediately. She carried it only halfway before setting it down abruptly, breathing harder than she expected. She sat there, hands resting on the lid of the box, staring at the faded photographs inside. They were full of images from trips, birthdays, and summers by the beach, moments from a life when her body could do so much more without complaint. The box itself became a symbol of what was happening. The weight hadn't changed, but she had. A few days later, Margaret took her dog, Molly, for a walk. The air was crisp, the sun bright through bare winter branches. Usually she would walk the loop around the neighborhood with ease, stopping only when Molly insisted on sniffing every bush along the way. But halfway through the route, she felt her legs stiffen. Each step required more effort. She glanced at Molly, trotting happily ahead, and thought, "If I feel this tired now, what will next year be like?" It was both a question and a warning. That night, she sat at the dining table with her laptop, reading about sarcopenia. She learned that it wasn't just about getting older, it was about losing muscle faster than you could replace it. She read stories of people her age who'd ignored the signs until it was too late, until they couldn't climb stairs without holding the railing or had to give up activities they loved. One article described it as a silent thief, and that phrase stuck with her. It felt exactly right. Sarcopenia was stealing her strength in the background, one quiet moment at a time. The more she read, the more she saw herself in the descriptions. Many people with sarcopenia didn't notice the changes until their mobility was significantly affected. By then, rebuilding strength was far harder. Margaret knew she didn't want to reach that point. She wanted to catch it early and fight back. Dr. Reynolds had told her, "Muscles are like savings accounts. If you stop adding to them, they shrink. But if you make regular deposits, through the right food and activity, they can last you much longer." She liked that comparison. It made her think of her own financial planning for retirement. Why hadn't she thought to save for her body in the same way? At dinner a few nights later, she brought it up with Richard. "You know," she said between bites of grilled salmon, "this thing I've been reading about, sarcopenia, it's not just some medical jargon, it's real. It's happening to me, and probably to a lot of our friends too." Richard set down his fork and looked at her. "So what are you going to do about it?" That was the question she needed. She didn't want to just worry, she wanted to act. Margaret began to pay closer attention to the moments that challenged her strength. Carrying laundry upstairs left her winded. Bending to tie her shoes felt like more of a stretch than it should. Reaching for the top shelf required her to brace herself on the counter. These were small things, but each one was a reminder that the thief was still at work. She found herself thinking about it even while doing ordinary tasks, imagining how life could become if she ignored it. That vision was enough to push her toward change. She started by making a quiet promise to herself. I will not let this thief take more than it already has. The first step, she decided, was to strengthen her body's defenses. She didn't yet know all the answers, but she knew where to start by looking at what went on her plate each day. If her muscles were like savings accounts, she needed to make bigger, better deposits, and that meant rethinking her protein sources. Margaret had always considered herself a fairly healthy eater, but now she saw gaps in her routine. A slice of toast with jam wasn't doing much for her muscles in the morning. A light salad at lunch, while fresh and colorful, wasn't giving her the strength-building fuel she needed. And while she often enjoyed eggs, she now knew they weren't the only or even the best source of protein for someone her age. That realization was oddly freeing. It meant there were other options out there, maybe even tastier ones, that could help her fight back against the thief. The next weekend, she went to the farmer's market with a different mindset. Instead of just buying what looked appealing, she walked slowly through the stalls, thinking about protein, muscle, and energy. She spoke with a local poultry farmer about chicken cuts, asked the grain vendor about quinoa, and even stopped at a stand selling fresh, soft cheese she'd never tried before. She felt like a student again, learning about her body's needs in a new, practical way. By the time she returned home, her kitchen counters were covered with ingredients that promised something more than just a good meal. They promised strength. She didn't know yet which ones would make the biggest difference, but she was ready to find out. Because now she understood that the silent thief could only be stopped by intentional action. And for Margaret, that action would begin in the heart of her home, the kitchen. Margaret had always believed eggs were one of the best things she could eat for her health. Every magazine article she'd read over the years seemed to call them nature's perfect protein. She had memories of her own mother making her soft-boiled eggs for breakfast before school, telling her, "This will make you strong." And in a way, it had always felt true. Eggs were simple, affordable, and familiar. Even in her busiest years of teaching, she could whip up scrambled eggs in minutes and feel she was doing something good for her body. So when Dr. Reynolds had suggested she diversify her protein sources, she was puzzled. Why mess with what works, she thought. But his words kept echoing in her mind. Eggs are good, Margaret, but they're not the best option for you now. At first, she assumed he meant she should cut back because of cholesterol or calories. But as she dug deeper into her reading about muscle preservation, she discovered something she hadn't expected. Eggs simply didn't have as much protein as she thought. One rainy afternoon, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, flipping through a health magazine. An article caught her eye. Protein density, choosing the right sources after 60. She scanned the chart and saw the numbers in black and white. 100 grams of eggs contained about 13 grams of protein. Chicken breast, around 27 grams. Certain cheeses, legumes, and grains, even more than eggs. She set the magazine down and stared out the window for a moment. She realized that while eggs were still valuable, they weren't giving her muscles as much fuel as she needed, especially now that her body's ability to process protein was less efficient than it had been in her 30s. That night, she brought it up at dinner with Richard. "Did you know," she began, sliding the magazine toward him, "that eggs don't actually have as much protein as chicken or even some plant foods?" He raised his eyebrows. "Really? I thought eggs were the gold standard," she nodded. "I did too, but it turns out if I'm relying on them as my main protein source, I'm probably falling short." Richard shrugged. "Well, maybe it's time we try something different. I don't mind if you get a little creative in the kitchen." Margaret smiled. She knew Richard's little creative meant she could experiment, but she also knew he didn't want anything too fancy or complicated. That suited her just fine. She wasn't aiming for gourmet meals, she was aiming for strength. Still, she felt a pang of nostalgia. Eggs had been a comforting constant in her diet for decades. They reminded her of Sunday brunches with her family, of easy weekday breakfasts before heading to school, of simple dinners when she was too tired to cook anything else. Letting go of the idea that they were the ultimate muscle food felt a bit like saying goodbye to an old friend. The following morning, she decided to test her new perspective. Instead of her usual poached eggs on toast, she made a small portion of grilled chicken breast with some steamed spinach and a sprinkle of lemon juice. It felt odd to eat chicken so early in the day, but she reminded herself that her muscles didn't care about the clock, they cared about getting the right fuel. Surprisingly, she felt more alert through the morning. She didn't experience the mid-morning dip that usually had her reaching for a biscuit with her tea. Over the next week, she began to notice small changes. Her energy was more stable. She didn't feel as tired after climbing the stairs. Even carrying groceries seemed a touch easier. It wasn't a miraculous transformation, but it was enough to keep her going. She kept eggs in her rotation. She still enjoyed them, but they became part of a broader strategy rather than the centerpiece. One evening, her daughter Emily stopped by with the grandchildren. While the kids played in the living room, Margaret and Emily chatted in the kitchen. Emily noticed the variety of ingredients on the counter: quinoa, lentils, a container of cottage cheese, and some fresh chicken. "You've been cooking differently," Emily observed. Margaret laughed softly. "Yes, I've learned a few things about protein. Turns out Mum didn't know everything after all." Emily grinned. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up. You seem brighter. Stronger, maybe." That simple remark meant more to Margaret than Emily probably realized. It confirmed what she had been sensing herself, that these changes, however small, were beginning to matter. She felt encouraged to keep exploring other protein-rich foods she had overlooked for years. Eggs would always have a place in her kitchen, but now they were part of a team rather than carrying the whole load alone. Margaret's journey was shifting from simply maintaining her health to actively building it. She had moved past the belief that weakness was inevitable or that her long-standing habits were beyond question. She was learning, meal by meal, that she could feed her body in ways that would help it stay strong for years to come. And with that realization, she was ready to discover what other foods could join her fight against the silent thief. Margaret had always believed that as you got older, you needed to eat less. That was what she'd heard from friends, from the occasional article, even from her own mother years ago. "We don't burn as much at our age," her mother used to say. "Best to keep portions small." And for most of her adult life, Margaret followed that advice. She avoided large meals, kept breakfast light, and often skipped snacks altogether. It seemed sensible until now. One rainy afternoon, while browsing through a health newsletter from her local clinic, she came across a headline that stopped her mid-sip of tea. "After 60, you may need more protein than you did at 30. She frowned, thinking it must be a typo, but as she read on, it became clear. The article explained how aging muscles become less efficient at processing protein, meaning older adults need more, not less, to maintain the same strength. It wasn't about overeating, it was about giving the body enough high-quality building blocks to replace what time quietly takes away. She thought back to Dr. Reynolds' words about her muscles being like a savings account. If her body wasn't depositing enough protein each day, it would be withdrawing from her muscle stores faster than she could replenish them. And that, she realized, was exactly what had been happening. Her light eating had turned into unintentional underfueling. It wasn't just about calories, it was about the type and amount of fuel her muscles needed to stay strong. That evening, she brought it up with Richard as they prepared dinner together. "You know," she began, slicing peppers for a stir-fry, "I've been doing it wrong all these years. I've been eating less, thinking it's better for me, but apparently I've been starving my muscles." Richard looked up from the cutting board, surprised. "More protein, you say? I thought that was only for bodybuilders." Margaret laughed softly. "Turns out it's also for grandmothers who want to keep lifting their grandkids." The more she learned, the more it made sense. Her energy dips in the afternoon, her slower recovery after gardening, the way her legs felt heavier after walks. These weren't just signs of age. They were signals from her body that it wasn't getting enough of what it needed. She realized she had been focusing so much on keeping meals light and avoiding heavy foods that she had unintentionally been leaving out the very nutrients that could help her stay mobile and independent. One Saturday morning, Margaret decided to put her new understanding into action. She made a hearty breakfast, grilled chicken slices with scrambled eggs, a side of sautéed spinach, and a small bowl of cottage cheese with berries. It was far more protein than she would normally eat before noon. She half expected to feel sluggish afterward, but instead she felt steady and alert well into the afternoon. Even her walk with Molly that day felt easier. There was no heavy drag in her legs, no mid-route pause to catch her breath. Encouraged, she began adjusting her other meals. Lunch might be a quinoa salad with lentils, chickpeas, and chopped vegetables, drizzled with olive oil. Dinner might feature baked fish alongside roasted sweet potatoes, and a side of steamed broccoli sprinkled with sesame seeds. She started carrying small containers of almonds in her handbag, knowing they were a quick, protein-rich snack. It wasn't about eating huge portions, it was about making every bite count. Her daughter Emily noticed the changes during their weekly visits. "Mum, you seem sharper lately," Emily remarked one afternoon as they sat on the porch. "And you've been moving around more easily." Margaret smiled. "I've been feeding my muscles better. Apparently they've been hungrier than I realized." She could see the curiosity in Emily's eyes, and a part of her felt proud, not just for herself, but for setting an example for her daughter and even her grandchildren. But Margaret also knew that understanding was only half the battle. Habits built over decades were not easy to change. It took planning to make sure each meal had enough protein, especially when old routines tugged her back toward tea and toast breakfasts or light, bread-heavy lunches. There were mornings she didn't feel like cooking anything extra. On those days, she reminded herself of that box of photo albums she had struggled to carry, of the heaviness in her legs halfway through a walk, of the way her hands had trembled over something as simple as lifting groceries. Those memories became her motivation. Dr. Reynolds was pleased at her next appointment. "You've got more energy in your step," he noted as she walked into his office. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." Margaret told him about her new approach to meals, and he nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right track. As we age, we need more high-quality protein to fight muscle loss. You're giving your body the tools it needs to stay strong." Hearing that from her doctor was the reassurance she needed. She wasn't just guessing anymore, she was on the right path. And now she wanted to go further. She knew eggs weren't the only answer, but they were still part of the puzzle. It was time to discover the other foods, some of them surprising, that could give her even more of what her body craved. Margaret had learned something life-changing. After 60, eating more protein wasn't indulgent, it was essential. And the sooner she embraced it, the longer she could keep doing the things she loved without fear of losing her independence. With this knowledge in hand, she was ready to find the foods that could truly outshine eggs in the fight to keep her muscles strong. Margaret's first real discovery came the following Saturday at the farmer's market. The air was crisp, the stalls bustling with chatter, and the smell of fresh herbs and baked bread drifted through the open square. She had her shopping basket on her arm and her mission in mind: find foods that could give her more protein than eggs. As she wandered past the vegetable stands and jars of homemade jam, she spotted a stall with a bright sign: farm-raised chicken, fresh, never frozen. Normally, she wouldn't have given it more than a passing glance. She'd cooked chicken before, of course, but never thought of it as anything extraordinary. But this time, she remembered reading that 100 grams of cooked chicken breast had nearly twice the protein of eggs, about 27 grams compared to the eggs' 13. Twice the protein meant twice the building blocks for her muscles. She decided to stop and have a closer look. The farmer behind the counter was a cheerful man with weathered hands and a friendly smile. "Looking for something special today?" he asked. Margaret explained in her gentle way that she was trying to eat more protein for strength. He nodded knowingly. "Chicken's perfect for that. It's lean, easy to cook, and has the amino acids your muscles need to stay strong. My wife's in her 70s and eats it almost every day." His words felt like a small piece of encouragement she didn't even know she needed. Margaret bought 2 plump chicken breasts, neatly wrapped in paper. That afternoon, she decided to cook one for lunch. Instead of frying, she followed the gentle cooking advice she'd read earlier, poaching it in a little vegetable broth until tender. The kitchen filled with a soft, savory aroma. She paired it with steamed spinach and a squeeze of lemon, keeping the meal simple. As she cut into the chicken, she was struck by how moist and delicate it was, so different from the dry, overcooked chicken she sometimes ended up with in the past. That first bite was a revelation, not just because of the flavor, but because of what it represented. She felt like she was giving her body something truly nourishing, a kind of strength in edible form. After lunch, she didn't feel heavy or sluggish, just comfortably satisfied. Even more surprisingly, she noticed that she wasn't reaching for her usual mid-afternoon biscuit. The steady, lasting energy from that meal carried her through the day. The next time she saw Dr. Reynolds, she mentioned her new habit. "That's an excellent choice," he told her. "Chicken's not just about protein, it also contains leucine, which helps tell your body to build and preserve muscle. And it's gentle on digestion, which is important as we get older." He suggested she aim for around 100 to 150 grams of cooked chicken on most days, but reminded her to prepare it in ways that preserved its nutrients. Over the next few weeks, chicken became a regular feature in Margaret's kitchen. Sometimes she baked it with a drizzle of olive oil and rosemary. Other days, she made a light chicken and vegetable soup, perfect for cooler evenings. Once, she diced leftover chicken into a quinoa salad with red peppers and cucumber for a refreshing lunch. Richard enjoyed it too, especially when she served it alongside roasted vegetables and a simple gravy. It was practical, affordable, and best of all, it worked. Margaret began to notice little victories. She could carry her grocery bags from the car to the kitchen without stopping. She could climb the stairs without feeling that dragging heaviness in her legs. One afternoon, she even managed to rearrange a couple of heavy plant pots in her garden, something she'd avoided for months. These were small moments, but to her, they felt monumental. Her daughter Emily noticed the changes too. One Sunday, while they were preparing lunch together, Emily said, "Mom, you seem stronger lately. Have you been working out?" Margaret laughed. "Not exactly. I've just been feeding my muscles better. Chicken's been my secret weapon," Emily smiled. "Well, whatever it is, keep doing it. You look brighter." Margaret found herself looking forward to meals in a way she hadn't in years. Instead of thinking of food as just something to get through the day, she began to see it as her partner in staying active. Each time she prepared chicken, she thought about how it was quietly helping her fight back against that silent thief, Sarcopenia. It was no longer just dinner, it was her way of defending her independence. She also discovered a trick that made her chicken meals even more powerful, pairing them with vitamin C-rich vegetables like red bell peppers or broccoli. She'd read that this combination helped her body absorb minerals like iron and zinc more effectively, minerals that were essential for muscle tone and endurance. The thought of maximizing every bite gave her a sense of quiet satisfaction. She was no longer just eating, she was strategizing for her future. One evening, as she and Richard sat down to a simple meal of roasted chicken and salad, she felt a wave of gratitude. Not just for the food on her plate, but for the fact that she'd taken those first steps to change her habits. She realized that she could have easily ignored the warning signs and chalked it all up to just aging, but instead she had listened, learned, and acted, and the payoff was already unfolding in her daily life. Margaret knew chicken wasn't the only food that could help her, but it had been her first real discovery, the first tangible step toward rebuilding her strength. It had shown her that change didn't have to be overwhelming. It could start with something as simple as choosing a better protein for lunch. And with that lesson firmly in place, she was ready to explore the next surprise on her list, a tiny, ancient seed that carried a surprisingly big punch. Margaret had been eating chicken regularly for only a few weeks, yet she could already feel the difference. It wasn't as though she'd suddenly turned into an athlete, but the small tasks of daily life, carrying laundry upstairs, bending to pick up Molly's leash, rearranging pots in her garden, no longer left her feeling drained. That quiet heaviness in her legs had started to lift. She found herself humming in the kitchen more often, a subtle sign that her energy was coming back. One morning, after her walk with Molly, she sat at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and decided to find out why chicken was making such a noticeable impact. She opened her laptop and began searching. Almost immediately, she came across a health article that explained exactly what she wanted to know. Chicken wasn't just high in protein, it contained complete protein, meaning it had all the essential amino acids her muscles needed to repair and grow. But what really caught her attention was a mention of leucine. She learned that leucine was like a little messenger that told the body, it's time to build muscle now. As people get older, their muscles become less responsive to these signals, so they need a stronger push to keep building strength. Chicken, it turned out, was one of the richest natural sources of leucine. Margaret leaned back in her chair, smiling to herself. No wonder Dr. Reynolds had encouraged her to keep it in her diet. She also discovered that chicken contained creatine, something she'd always associated with young gym-goers and bodybuilders. But the article explained that creatine was simply a natural compound stored in muscles to help produce quick bursts of energy, whether that's sprinting upstairs, carrying heavy bags, or even just standing up from a low chair. For someone like Margaret, who wanted to maintain independence and avoid fatigue, this was an invisible but powerful ally. That afternoon, she mentioned it to Richard while they prepared dinner. "It's not just the protein," she said, slicing carrots for a salad. "Chicken has these little helpers, leucine and creatine, that actually tell my body to build and protect muscle. It's like giving my body marching orders." Richard chuckled. So you're telling me chicken is bossy? I can see why you like it. She laughed, but she knew there was truth in his teasing. She did like the idea of her food working actively on her behalf. Margaret also thought about digestion. She'd noticed that chicken sat more comfortably in her stomach than some heavier meats she'd eaten in the past. The reading she'd done confirmed that lean chicken breast was easier to digest, making it perfect for older adults who might have slower digestion. That explained why she could eat it for breakfast or lunch and still feel light yet sustained throughout the day. Another interesting detail she found was how cooking methods mattered. High heat grilling or deep frying could damage some of the beneficial compounds and add unnecessary fats. Gentle methods like steaming, baking at a moderate temperature, or poaching helped keep its nutrients intact. This matched what she'd already discovered through her own cooking experiments. Poached chicken in vegetable broth had become one of her favorite ways to prepare it. Soft, flavorful, and perfect for adding to salads or wraps. Her new habit was becoming second nature. Twice a week, she made a larger batch of chicken and stored portions in the fridge. This way, she could quickly add it to a quinoa bowl for lunch, slice it into a leafy green salad, or simply enjoy it with roasted vegetables for dinner. She found herself eating less bread and processed snacks simply because she was more satisfied after meals. It was a change that happened naturally, without forcing herself to diet. Emily noticed the difference during their weekend visit. "Mum, you're walking faster these days," Emily said as they strolled to the park with the kids. Margaret smiled. "It's the chicken," she replied. Emily laughed. "If chicken can do that, maybe I should start eating more of it too." Margaret didn't mind the joke. She liked that her daughter could see real evidence of her efforts. But what mattered most to Margaret wasn't just the physical improvement. It was the sense of control she felt over her own health. She had spent months feeling as though her strength was quietly slipping away, powerless to stop it. Now she understood that with the right choices, like making chicken a regular part of her diet, she could fight back. She didn't have to wait until she needed help carrying her groceries or getting out of a chair. She could act now on her own terms. Her confidence grew with each little success. One afternoon, she carried 2 full shopping bags from the car to the kitchen without stopping, something that would have left her winded not long ago. She even started walking Molly for an extra loop around the block. These moments were proof that her body was responding, slowly but surely, to the care she was giving it. Margaret began to see chicken not just as food, but as part of her plan, her quiet daily strategy for keeping the silent thief at bay. And with this new understanding, she felt ready to explore other protein-rich foods that could join chicken in her fight. The next one on her list was a tiny seed with an impressive reputation, something she'd passed over many times at the store without realizing the strength it carried inside. Margaret first noticed quinoa while walking down the health food aisle at her local supermarket. It was in a neat row of paper bags, each with a picture of tiny beige and reddish seeds on the front. She had seen them before, maybe in cooking magazines or on recipe blogs, but had never paid much attention. To her, quinoa had always been one of those modern health fads for young people obsessed with diet trends. But lately, she had learned that her muscles needed variety, different kinds of high-quality protein, and she was curious to see if this little seed could earn a place at her table. Later that evening, she did what she had been doing a lot more of lately: research. To her surprise, quinoa wasn't new at all. It had been cultivated for thousands of years in South America, treasured by the Inca for its ability to sustain strength and stamina in high mountain regions. What truly caught her attention, though, was that quinoa was one of the rare plant foods that contained all 9 essential amino acids, making it a complete protein, just like chicken. Not only that, but 100 grams of cooked quinoa had more protein than many other grains and came with a host of minerals her muscles and bones desperately needed. The next day, Margaret decided to buy a bag and give it a try. When she poured the small seeds into a bowl to rinse them, she was struck by how simple they looked, almost like tiny pearls. She read that soaking them for several hours or overnight could help improve their digestibility and reduce certain compounds that made it harder for the body to absorb minerals. She followed the instructions carefully, determined to give herself the best chance of success. Cooking quinoa was easier than she expected. She toasted it lightly in a dry pan first, just as one online article suggested, to bring out a warm, nutty aroma. Then she simmered it gently in water until each seed turned translucent and sprouted a little curly tail. It was almost beautiful to watch. She fluffed it with a fork, tasted it, and found it pleasantly mild with a subtle nuttiness. It didn't shout for attention, but it had a comforting, wholesome feel. For her first quinoa meal, she kept things simple, tossing it with steamed broccoli, cherry tomatoes, and a squeeze of lemon. She added a few slices of leftover chicken from the night before, turning it into a balanced, protein-rich lunch. The colors on the plate alone made her feel healthier. More importantly, the meal left her satisfied for hours, without the sluggishness that sometimes came after a bread-heavy lunch. Within a few weeks, quinoa became a regular part of her routine. Sometimes she made it the base for a hearty salad, other times she stirred it into vegetable soups for extra texture. On cooler mornings, she even tried it as a warm breakfast bowl, cooked in a bit of milk and topped with berries and a sprinkle of cinnamon. The versatility was a pleasant surprise. She could make it savory or slightly sweet, depending on her mood. What she loved most, though, was how quinoa seemed to give her a steady, quiet energy throughout the day. It wasn't the burst and crash feeling she sometimes got from bread or sugary snacks. Instead, it was like a gentle current carrying her along, helping her stay focused, steady on her feet, and ready to tackle her daily tasks. When Margaret mentioned quinoa to Dr. Reynolds during her next appointment, he smiled. Excellent choice. Quinoa gives you plant-based protein, which is great for variety, but it also comes packed with magnesium and potassium, minerals that help with muscle relaxation, nerve function, and heart health. And the fiber is a bonus for digestion. She felt reassured that this small seed was doing more for her than she'd realized. One weekend, Emily came over with the grandchildren, and Margaret decided to serve quinoa for lunch. She made a colorful quinoa and lentil salad with diced red peppers, cucumber, parsley, and a light olive oil dressing. To her delight, the children enjoyed it, especially when she told them the seeds had been eaten by ancient warriors. Emily raised her eyebrows. Ancient warriors, huh? Clever, Mum, Margaret smiled. She wasn't just feeding her family, she was passing on a story, a connection to a food that had sustained people for centuries. Over time, quinoa became more than just another protein source in Margaret's kitchen. It became a symbol of how she was willing to try new things for the sake of her health. Before this journey began, she might have brushed it off as too fancy or not for her. Now she saw it as part of a growing toolkit, one more way to feed her muscles, protect her independence, and keep that silent thief at bay. She also discovered that combining quinoa with other foods could amplify its benefits. Mixing it with beans or lentils created an even more complete nutrient profile. Serving it alongside chicken or fish gave her meals a satisfying balance of textures and flavors. She learned that adding a splash of lemon juice or tossing it with vitamin C-rich vegetables helped her body absorb the iron in the quinoa more efficiently. It was these small tweaks, simple, thoughtful adjustments that made her feel she was truly learning how to nourish herself with intention. One quiet afternoon, as she sat at the kitchen table with a warm bowl of quinoa and vegetable soup, Margaret thought about how far she had come. A year ago, she might have scoffed at the idea of eating something like this regularly. But now it was part of a lifestyle she was building with care, a lifestyle where every meal was an opportunity to choose strength over decline. And she realized something important. While chicken had given her the confidence that food could make a difference, quinoa had shown her that even the smallest things, a tiny seed, could carry immense power. Her next step would be to explore yet another plant-based ally, one she had heard of all her life but never truly appreciated for its strength-building potential. It was time for soy to take its place in her growing arsenal of muscle-protecting foods. Margaret had always thought of soy as something mostly eaten in Asia or by people who didn't eat meat. She had tried soy milk once years ago, found the taste unusual, and never gave it another thought. But lately, her research into protein-rich foods kept bringing soy back into the conversation. She read again and again that soy wasn't just a decent plant protein. It was one of the few that, like quinoa, contained all 9 essential amino acids. Even more interesting, it came with extra benefits that could help protect not just her muscles, but her bones too. It was a rainy Tuesday when she first decided to give soy another chance. She had gone to the local health food shop to pick up quinoa and a few fresh vegetables. There, in the refrigerated section, she spotted neat blocks of tofu, cartons of soy milk, and packages of bright green edamame beans. She hesitated, unsure where to start. A friendly shop assistant noticed her scanning the shelf and asked if she needed help. Margaret explained that she was looking for ways to add more protein to her meals without relying solely on meat. The assistant smiled. Soy is perfect for that, especially for women in their 60s and beyond. It's rich in protein, gentle on digestion, and has isoflavones, which can help keep your bones strong. That last part caught Margaret's attention. She had been quietly concerned about bone health ever since her mother had been diagnosed with osteoporosis in her 70s. She knew that as women aged, the natural decline in estrogen could lead to thinning bones. If soy could help slow that process, she wanted to know more. She bought a block of firm tofu, a bag of frozen-shelled edamame, and a small carton of unsweetened soy milk, determined to give them a fair try. Her first experiment was simple. She boiled the edamame in lightly salted water, drained them, and sprinkled them with a pinch of sea salt. They were surprisingly delicious, nutty, slightly sweet, and satisfying to pop from their skins. Later that week, she sliced the tofu into cubes, marinated them in soy sauce, ginger, and garlic, and lightly pan-seared them until golden. Served with steamed broccoli and quinoa, it made for a colorful and protein-rich dinner that even Richard enjoyed. "This is actually good," he admitted, looking a little surprised. The more she read, the more convinced she became that soy deserved a place in her regular rotation. She learned that the isoflavones in soy mimic some of the mild effects of estrogen in the body, helping to slow bone loss and potentially reduce the risk of fractures. Combined with its muscle-preserving protein, it was like hitting two targets with one arrow. Dr. Reynolds later confirmed this during her next visit. "Soy can be an excellent ally, Margaret. It helps support muscle repair and bone density at the same time. And for someone like you, staying strong means protecting both." She began finding small, easy ways to add soy to her meals. A splash of soy milk in her morning porridge, a handful of edamame tossed into a salad, a few slices of tofu in a vegetable stir-fry. None of it felt forced or complicated. In fact, she found it easier than she expected to incorporate soy into her weekly meal plan. The variety also kept her from feeling bored with her protein sources. One Saturday afternoon, Emily and the grandchildren came over for lunch. Margaret decided to make a colorful soy and vegetable stir-fry with tofu, carrots, bell peppers, and baby corn served over brown rice. When Emily raised an eyebrow and asked, "Tofu, Mum?" Margaret grinned. "Trust me, you'll like it." By the end of the meal, even the children were picking out the tofu pieces and asking for seconds. Emily laughed. "All right, I admit it, you've converted me." Margaret noticed that with soy in her diet, she felt more balanced in her energy levels throughout the day. Meals kept her full longer, and she had fewer cravings for sugary snacks in the afternoon. She also appreciated how gentle it was on her digestion, especially on days when she didn't feel like eating heavier meats. It was becoming a reliable option, one she could reach for without much thought, knowing it was doing her body good. Perhaps the most meaningful moment came a few weeks later when she was tidying up the living room. She bent down to pick up a heavy box of books and stood up again without feeling the usual twinge in her lower back. It was a small thing, but it made her pause. She realized that the combination of chicken, quinoa, and now soy was quietly building her resilience, not just in her muscles, but in the bones that supported them. Margaret had started this journey thinking only about muscle strength, but soy had opened her eyes to a bigger picture. Staying independent wasn't just about keeping her legs strong enough to walk or her arms strong enough to lift. It was also about protecting the framework that held her together. Her muscles and bones were partners, and both needed her care. She knew she still had more foods to discover on her list, each with its own way of helping her stay strong. The next one she had read was humble and unassuming, just a small lentil that could quietly power her days with steady energy and lasting strength. And as she had learned already, it's often the simplest things that make the biggest difference. Margaret had always thought of lentils as something that belonged in hearty winter soups or vegetarian cookbooks she never really read. She remembered her mother making lentil stew once or twice when she was a child, but it was never a regular feature in her family's kitchen. In her mind, lentils were humble, almost plain, certainly not the sort of thing you'd imagine could help someone rebuild strength. But during her search for high-protein foods, she kept coming across their name again and again. One quiet Thursday morning, she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook, reviewing the list of foods she had already added to her diet. Chicken, quinoa, soy. She realized they all brought something unique to the table, and she wondered what lentils could offer that she didn't already have. A quick bit of reading gave her the answer. Lentils were not only a solid source of plant-based protein, about 9 grams per cooked cup, but they were also packed with iron, folate, magnesium, and potassium. These nutrients supported oxygen delivery in the body, heart health, and even brain function. And their high fiber content helped stabilize blood sugar and keep energy levels steady. The more she read, the more curious she became. She discovered that lentils came in different varieties: green, brown, red, and even black, each with a slightly different texture and flavor. Some were hearty and earthy, perfect for soups and stews. Others cooked quickly into a soft, almost creamy texture, ideal for curries or spreads. This versatility appealed to her, especially since she liked the idea of keeping her meals interesting. Margaret decided to start with something simple: a pot of green lentil soup. She rinsed the lentils carefully, remembering an article that recommended soaking them for a few hours to help with digestion and to reduce compounds that could block mineral absorption. Into her soup pot went diced onions, carrots, and celery, sautéed gently in olive oil until fragrant. She added the soaked lentils, poured in vegetable broth, and let everything simmer slowly. As the lentils softened, the kitchen filled with a rich, comforting aroma. At lunchtime, she ladled the steaming soup into a bowl, added a squeeze of lemon for brightness, and sat down at the table. The first spoonful was earthy and satisfying. It was the kind of meal that warmed her from the inside out, but without the heaviness of some other comfort foods. She noticed how full she felt after just one bowl. Full in a calm, steady way, not in the overstuffed, sluggish way she sometimes felt after eating bread or pasta. Over the next few weeks, lentils found their way into more of her meals. She added red lentils to vegetable curries, making them thick and nourishing. She tossed cooked green lentils into salads with spinach, cherry tomatoes, and a light vinaigrette for a quick, protein-rich lunch. Sometimes she paired them with quinoa, creating a simple but powerful combination of complete proteins. Richard, to her mild surprise, didn't mind the new addition. "These are better than I expected," he admitted one evening over dinner. "They actually taste hearty." Margaret smiled, pleased that her efforts to expand their diet were paying off. She knew that for both of them, these changes were about more than just eating well. They were about protecting their ability to live fully and independently for years to come. She also noticed another benefit. Lentils seemed to give her a long-lasting energy that carried her through the day. On mornings when she had lentils for lunch, she could spend the afternoon gardening or running errands without that mid-afternoon slump. The steady release of energy from their combination of protein and complex carbohydrates was exactly what her body needed to keep moving. During her next visit with Dr. Reynolds, she mentioned her new fondness for lentils. He nodded approvingly. "They're an excellent choice, high in fiber, good for your heart, and they help regulate blood sugar. For someone your age, that's especially important. And paired with vitamin C-rich foods, you'll absorb their iron even better." Margaret made a mental note to keep adding lemon juice or fresh tomatoes to her lentil dishes. One Saturday, Emily dropped by with the grandchildren, and Margaret served them a mild red lentil curry with warm flatbread. She didn't say much about its health benefits, she just let the flavors speak for themselves. To her delight, the children dipped their bread eagerly and asked for seconds. Emily laughed. "Looks like you found another winner, Mum." Margaret felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She wasn't just feeding herself better, she was subtly encouraging her whole family to eat in ways that could help them stay strong too. Lentils, she realized, were proof that good food didn't have to be expensive or complicated. A small bag cost very little, yet it could make enough for several meals. They stored well in the pantry, cooked quickly, and adapted to whatever flavors she felt like using. And best of all, they were helping her build strength in a way that felt natural and sustainable. As she cleared the table that evening, Margaret thought about how far she'd come since the day she first noticed that heaviness in her legs. Each new food she had added to her diet was like another brick in the foundation she was building for her future. Lentils, humble as they were, had earned their place alongside chicken, quinoa, and soy in her growing collection of strength-preserving staples. She knew there was still one more protein-rich ally she wanted to explore. Something creamy and comforting, yet surprisingly powerful in helping muscles recover and stay strong. That would be her next step, bringing cottage cheese into her daily routine and seeing how it could support the progress she was making. Margaret had always enjoyed cheese, but in her mind, it was more of a treat than a health food. A slice of cheddar on crackers in the afternoon, a sprinkle of parmesan over pasta, those were her usual indulgences. But as she explored new high-protein foods, she began coming across an unexpected suggestion: cottage cheese. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't trendy, and frankly, she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten it. But the more she read, the more it seemed like a quiet powerhouse, especially for someone her age who wanted to keep her muscles strong. One Saturday morning, she found herself in the dairy aisle at her local supermarket, scanning the shelves. The containers of cottage cheese sat quietly in the corner, plain white tubs with modest labels. She picked one up and read the nutrition panel, about 11 grams of protein per 100 grams, plus a good amount of calcium. And most intriguing of all, the protein in cottage cheese was casein, a slow-digesting type that could feed muscles gradually over several hours, perfect for overnight recovery. She remembered something Dr. Reynolds had said about giving muscles the right fuel even while resting. This, she thought, might be exactly what he meant. Back at home, she opened the tub and gave it a cautious taste. The texture was soft and slightly lumpy, the flavor mild and milky. It wasn't love at first bite, but it wasn't unpleasant either, just different. She decided to experiment. She stirred in a few chopped strawberries and a drizzle of honey, transforming it into something gently sweet and refreshing. That evening, she had a small bowl before bed instead of her usual biscuit with tea. It felt oddly satisfying, and she liked knowing that her body would be making use of that slow-release protein through the night. The next morning, she noticed something subtle. She didn't wake up feeling quite as stiff in her legs as she often did. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough to make her curious. Over the next week, she continued having cottage cheese before bed, sometimes with fruit, other times with a sprinkle of cinnamon or a spoonful of crushed walnuts. She began to think of it as her muscle snack, a quiet little ritual that signaled her body it was time to rest and repair. Richard, of course, noticed the change in her evening routine. One night he asked, "What's with the cheese bowl every night?" Margaret smiled. "It's not just cheese, it's casein protein. Feeds my muscles while I sleep." He raised an eyebrow. "Well, as long as you don't start lifting weights at midnight." She laughed, but she knew there was a serious side to it. This small, simple habit was helping her body fight the very thing that had worried her so much only a few months ago, losing strength without realizing it. She also discovered that cottage cheese was more versatile than she expected. She mixed it into omelets for extra protein at breakfast, blended it into smoothies for a creamy texture, and even used it as a topping for baked sweet potatoes with a sprinkle of chives. On warm days, she made a light lunch of cottage cheese with sliced cucumber, cherry tomatoes, and a drizzle of olive oil. It was gentle on her digestion, quick to prepare, and surprisingly filling. At her next appointment, she told Dr. Reynolds about her new bedtime snack. He nodded in approval. "That's an excellent choice, Margaret. Cottage cheese not only helps preserve muscle mass, but also supports bone health with its calcium content. And the B12 is great for your energy and brain function." She felt reassured that this was more than just a passing experiment. It was a real, meaningful addition to her diet. Emily noticed the difference as well. One afternoon, as they walked to the park with the grandchildren, Emily remarked, "Mom, you've been keeping up with the kids more lately. I've barely seen you stop to catch your breath." Margaret smiled, thinking about the small, steady changes she'd made: chicken, quinoa, soy, lentils, and now cottage cheese. None of them had been overwhelming on their own, but together they were creating a foundation of strength she could feel in her everyday life. One evening, after a full day of gardening, Margaret prepared her usual bowl of cottage cheese with sliced peaches. As she ate, she thought about how much her perspective on food had changed. A year ago, she would have ended the day with a sugary treat and thought nothing of it. Now she chose something that not only satisfied her taste buds, but also worked quietly through the night to keep her strong. It wasn't about perfection or restriction, it was about feeding her body in a way that respected the life she wanted to live. Cottage cheese had become more than just a bedtime snack. It was a symbol of the slow, steady effort she was making to care for herself. And as she scraped the last spoonful from the bowl, she felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the food, but for the fact that she had taken charge of her health one small choice at a time. Her collection of muscle-friendly foods was growing, and so was her confidence. Now she was ready to go beyond single ingredients and start thinking about how to combine them into meals that would give her maximum strength and energy every day. Margaret had come a long way since the day she first realized her strength was slipping. She had collected a small but powerful team of foods: chicken, quinoa, soy, lentils, and cottage cheese, and each one brought something unique to her table. But now she began to wonder, what if I put them together? If one food could help her muscles, perhaps a thoughtful combination could do even more. One rainy afternoon, she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and a steaming mug of tea, jotting down ideas. She remembered something Dr. Reynolds had told her. Think of your meals like a team sport. Each player has a role, but they work best when they work together. The idea made her smile. She imagined her protein-rich foods lined up like a winning squad, each ready to play their part in keeping her strong. Her first experiment was a warm quinoa and lentil salad. She cooked the quinoa until fluffy, simmered green lentils until tender, and tossed them together with chopped parsley, diced red bell peppers, and a light drizzle of olive oil. Then she added strips of poached chicken on top. It was colorful, hearty, and full of flavors that felt fresh and alive. The combination of proteins gave her a deep sense of satisfaction, and she found herself feeling energized well into the evening. Encouraged, she tried other pairings. One morning, she blended cottage cheese into her scrambled eggs and served them alongside a slice of whole grain toast and a small side of edamame beans. The soft creaminess of the cottage cheese made the eggs taste richer, and the combination kept her full until lunchtime. She noticed she didn't feel that familiar late-morning dip in energy that used to have her reaching for tea and a biscuit. Richard, ever her willing taste tester, began to notice the difference too. "These meals of yours," he said one evening over dinner, "they make me feel like I could go for a walk after instead of just sitting in my chair." Margaret grinned. That's the idea. Fuel that helps us recover, not just fill us up. She also began paying attention to how different combinations affected her recovery after more active days. If she'd spent the afternoon gardening or taking a longer walk, she made sure her dinner included both fast and slow-digesting proteins. For example, she might have grilled chicken for the quick repair benefits, along with a small bowl of cottage cheese for the slow overnight support. She thought of it as giving her muscles both an immediate boost and a steady drip of nutrients while she slept. One of her favorite discoveries was how well soy paired with other foods. She started making stir-fries with tofu, quinoa, and a mix of bright vegetables, finishing the dish with a sprinkle of sesame seeds and a squeeze of lemon. The tofu soaked up the flavors beautifully, and the quinoa added a satisfying texture. She found that by including both plant and animal proteins in the same meal, she felt more balanced, less heavy than with a meat-only dinner, but more sustained than with plants alone. On Sunday afternoons, she began preparing what she called her strength bowls for the week ahead. Each bowl started with a base of quinoa or lentils, then she layered on cooked chicken, a spoonful of cottage cheese, and a handful of lightly steamed vegetables. Sometimes she added a few edamame beans or chickpeas for extra variety. She stored them in the fridge so that during busy days she could simply grab one, reheat it if needed, and know she was getting a balanced, recovery-friendly meal without much effort. Emily, ever curious, asked about them one day. "Mom, what's with the little bowls all lined up in your fridge?" Margaret laughed. "Those are my secret weapon. Every time I eat one, it's like telling my muscles, 'I've got you covered.'" Emily smiled. "Well, you certainly seem to have more spring in your step lately." Margaret also started noticing that by planning her meals this way, she wasn't just recovering better, she was avoiding the small aches and stiffness that used to creep in after an active day. It wasn't magic, it was simply giving her body the exact building blocks it needed, right when it needed them. And that made her feel more in control of her aging process than she ever had before. One quiet evening, as she sat at the kitchen table with Richard enjoying a simple dinner of chicken, lentils, and steamed greens, she realized something important. She no longer thought of eating for strength as a chore. It had become a natural part of her life, woven into her daily rhythm. She cooked with purpose, but without stress. She chose her foods with intention, but also with enjoyment. And perhaps most satisfying of all, she could see the results not just in how she felt, but in the way she lived. She carried her shopping bags more easily. She walked Molly further without dreading the return trip. She spent more time in the garden without having to sit down every half hour. Recovery was no longer just about bouncing back from activity. It was about building a body that could handle whatever she wanted to do, whenever she wanted to do it. Margaret knew there were still more lessons to learn, more ways to fine-tune her meals and lifestyle for long-term strength. But for now, she felt proud of how far she had come, Combining her new favorite foods wasn't just about variety, it was about creating harmony on her plate and in her body. And with each balanced meal, she was quietly, steadily making herself stronger than she had been in years. Margaret had learned the science. She'd discovered the foods, she'd experimented with combinations. Now the next step was to make these habits so easy that she could stick to them even on the busiest or most tiring days. After all, she knew that consistency, not just the occasional healthy meal, was the real key to staying strong and steady. One breezy Monday morning, she stood in her kitchen looking at the week ahead. She didn't want to overcomplicate things. She remembered what Dr. Reynolds had said. Healthy eating should feel like second nature. If it feels like a burden, it won't last. With that in mind, she began planning simple meals she could make quickly without fuss and still get all the nutrients her muscles and bones needed. Her first go-to was a chicken and quinoa bowl. She kept cooked quinoa and sliced poached chicken in the fridge at all times. When it was time for lunch, she simply added a handful of spinach, a few cherry tomatoes, and a light dressing of olive oil and lemon juice. It took less than 5 minutes to assemble, but it filled her with steady energy all afternoon. For evenings when she wanted something warm and comforting, she made lentil and vegetable soup. She'd cook a large pot on Sunday, rich with carrots, celery, onions, and garlic, then portion it into containers. Some nights she added diced chicken for extra protein. Other nights she topped it with a spoonful of cottage cheese for a creamy finish. This way she could have a hot, nourishing meal ready in minutes, no temptation to reach for processed foods. Breakfast had always been the trickiest meal for her. She'd been used to quick toast and tea for decades. But now she had a few easy swaps. One favorite was cottage cheese with fruit and nuts. Soft peaches or berries in summer, sliced apple in cooler months, with a sprinkle of walnuts for crunch. On days when she wanted something heartier, she blended cottage cheese into scrambled eggs, making them extra creamy and doubling the protein. Margaret also discovered a simple snack that became her afternoon pick-me-up: edamame with a pinch of sea salt. They were quick to steam from frozen, fun to eat, and full of plant protein. Paired with a few slices of cucumber or a cup of green tea, it was enough to keep her feeling light yet satisfied until dinner. One afternoon, Emily stopped by and caught her preparing several of these meals at once. "Mom, you've turned your kitchen into a little meal prep station," Emily teased. Margaret laughed. "It's my insurance policy. I know myself. If I don't have these ready, I'll end up grabbing something that doesn't do my muscles any favors." Richard, too, was benefiting from her new approach. He found that the ready-made chicken and quinoa bowls made a perfect lunch after his morning walk, and he enjoyed the lentil soup on cooler evenings. Margaret liked that her efforts were helping both of them, not just keeping her strong, but supporting the man who had been by her side for decades. But more than convenience, these easy meals gave her a sense of control. She no longer felt like she was reacting to hunger with whatever happened to be in the fridge. Instead, she was making deliberate choices that aligned with her goal of staying mobile, steady, and independent. It was a quiet but powerful shift, one that made her feel prepared for the future. She also started keeping a small list on the fridge: 3 proteins, 3 vegetables, 3 extras. As long as she had at least one from each category, she could throw together a quick, balanced meal. Proteins might be chicken, cottage cheese, or lentils. Vegetables could be spinach, bell peppers, or broccoli. Extras were things like olive oil, nuts, or quinoa. This little system kept her from overthinking things and made grocery shopping faster. Her meals didn't have to be perfect or elaborate. They just had to be consistent. And because she had found a rhythm she enjoyed, it didn't feel like a chore. She could still make the occasional treat, still enjoy dinner out with friends, but she always came back to these simple staples. They were her anchor. One evening, after a full day spent in the garden, she sat down to a warm bowl of lentil soup topped with a spoonful of cottage cheese, a small slice of whole grain bread on the side. She looked at the meal and realized something. These foods were more than just fuel. They were her way of taking care of herself in a way she never quite had before, not just hoping to stay healthy, but actively building a foundation for the years ahead. Margaret knew that there would still be days when she felt tired or when life's little disruptions might throw her off course. But with her easy meal system in place, she felt confident she could always find her way back. And that confidence, as much as the protein on her plate, was what would keep her strong and steady for a long time to come. Margaret had made enormous progress in changing what she ate. Her kitchen now looked like a treasure chest of muscle-friendly foods, fresh chicken, bags of quinoa and lentils, blocks of tofu, tubs of cottage cheese. But one rainy afternoon, while reading an article in a senior health magazine, she came across a sentence that made her pause. Even the healthiest food can lose much of its nutritional value or even become harmful if cooked the wrong way. She set down her tea and read the paragraph twice. It explained how certain cooking methods, particularly deep frying, charring over high flames, or cooking for too long, could damage delicate proteins, destroy important vitamins, and create compounds that were hard on the body. Margaret felt a small twinge of concern. She had been proud of her new eating habits, but she had never really considered how the way she cooked might change what she was getting from her food. She thought back to the way she sometimes pan-fried chicken until it was a deep golden brown, more for the crispy texture than for any real culinary reason. She remembered the few times she'd left quinoa boiling too long until it turned into a gluey mess, and she recalled her occasional fondness for grilled meats with dark, charred edges. She now realized that each of these habits, while not disastrous on their own, might be quietly reducing the benefits of her careful food choices. Determined to learn more, she did what had become her new habit. She researched. She discovered that high heat could denature proteins in a way that made them less bioavailable. Frying could add unnecessary fats and, worse, introduce harmful compounds called advanced glycation. End products, AGEs, which were linked to inflammation and aging. Overcooking vegetables could leach out their vitamins, while undercooking certain legumes could leave behind compounds that blocked mineral absorption. Margaret didn't panic, but she took note. She decided to treat cooking as part of her strength plan, just as important as the food itself. Her first change was to switch to gentler cooking methods for her proteins. Instead of pan-frying chicken in oil, she started poaching it in low-sodium broth or baking it at a moderate temperature with a drizzle of olive oil. The meat stayed moist, the flavors were fresh, and she felt good knowing the nutrients were staying intact. Next, she paid attention to her plant-based proteins. For lentils, she followed the soaking advice she had learned earlier, but she also made sure to simmer them gently rather than boiling them furiously. For tofu, she discovered that a light pan-sear in a non-stick pan with just a touch of olive oil gave it a satisfying golden crust without overcooking. And for quinoa, she perfected the technique of toasting it lightly before simmering, locking in flavor without destroying its delicate amino acids. Vegetables got a makeover too. Margaret used to boil them until they were limp and pale. Now she lightly steamed broccoli, spinach, and carrots so they stayed vibrant and crisp tender. This not only preserved their vitamins, but also made her plates look more colorful and inviting. She even noticed that her appetite responded differently to a plate full of bright, fresh-looking food compared to a dull, overcooked one. One evening, while preparing dinner, Richard wandered into the kitchen. "You're treating this chicken like it's fine china," he joked, watching her gently poach the breast in simmering broth. Margaret smiled. "Well, it's my muscle insurance. I'm not wasting a single bite of what it can give me." Richard chuckled and left her to her careful work. Margaret also became more mindful of avoiding processed shortcuts. She realized that pre-breaded chicken fillets, instant quinoa packets with seasoning, or canned lentil soups often came loaded with extra sodium, preservatives, or low-quality oils. She decided it was worth the small extra effort to prepare these foods herself. That way, she controlled what went in and what stayed out. Within a few weeks of cooking this way, she felt a noticeable difference. Meals seemed to digest more easily, and she didn't get the occasional bloating she used to after heavier dinners. Her energy felt steadier, without the sluggishness that sometimes followed fried or overly rich meals. She even noticed her skin looking a bit brighter, something she hadn't expected but certainly didn't mind. Emily noticed too. One Sunday lunch, as they all sat down to a meal of gently baked chicken, steamed broccoli, and a quinoa lentil salad, she remarked, "Mom, everything tastes so fresh lately. You've really upped your game." Margaret grinned. "Turns out it's not just what you eat, but how you treat it before it gets to your plate." She realized that by avoiding common cooking mistakes, she wasn't just protecting nutrients, she was showing respect for the food she had chosen so carefully. Every chicken breast, every spoonful of quinoa, every handful of lentils was part of her plan to stay strong, steady, and independent. And by preparing them properly, she was giving herself the best chance to reap their full benefits. Margaret had learned one more important truth on her journey. Healthy eating isn't only about ingredients. It's a chain of small, intentional choices, from the grocery shelf, to the cutting board, to the pot, to the plate. And each link in that chain matters. With her cooking habits refined, she felt ready for the next step, discovering the small, consistent daily habits that could lock in all the progress she'd made and keep her strength growing for years to come. Margaret had reached a point in her journey where the foods, the recipes, and even the cooking methods felt comfortable, second nature almost. Her kitchen was stocked with chicken, quinoa, lentils, soy, and cottage cheese. Her fridge held neatly prepared meal bowls, ready to be reheated on busy days. But one afternoon, as she sat with her tea and reflected on the past months, she realized something important. None of it mattered if she didn't keep going. She thought back to the times in her life when she had started something with enthusiasm, only to let it fade. There was the yoga class she joined one winter, attending faithfully for a few weeks before skipping. Just this once turned into never going back. Or the walking group she'd joined with neighbors that fizzled out after a few rainy Saturdays. She didn't want this to be another one of those stories. The difference now was that this wasn't a hobby. It was her health, her strength, her independence. She remembered something Dr. Reynolds had said early in her journey. Consistency beats intensity every time. It's what you do most days, not just once in a while, that shapes your future. Those words had stayed with her, but only now did she truly understand their weight. So she decided to make her new habits as easy and automatic as brushing her teeth. That meant removing as many barriers as possible. She kept cooked quinoa and chicken in the fridge at all times, so lunch could be assembled in minutes. She stocked the pantry with bags of lentils and cans of low-sodium beans, ready for quick soups or salads. She froze extra portions of cooked meals so she could defrost something nourishing on days she didn't feel like cooking. Margaret also set gentle rules for herself. She aimed to include at least one high-protein food in every meal. She decided that if she ever went a day without cooking, she'd make sure to have cottage cheese or a lentil salad ready so she wouldn't slip into old habits of tea and toast. And perhaps most importantly, she promised herself she wouldn't wait for motivation. She would simply follow her system. She found that keeping a small food journal helped. It wasn't about counting calories or being strict, but about keeping a gentle eye on her patterns. She liked looking back at a week's worth of meals and seeing how often she hit her protein goals. It made her feel proud, like she was investing in herself day after day. Emily noticed her mother's new rhythm. One Saturday morning, she dropped by to find Margaret calmly poaching chicken while a pot of lentil soup simmered on the stove. "Mom, you're like a machine," Emily said with a laugh. Margaret smiled. "Not a machine, love. Just someone who knows that if I stop, it's twice as hard to start again." Even Richard had absorbed some of her consistency. He began to expect the quinoa bowls for lunch and the lentil soups in the evening. On days when Margaret suggested skipping and ordering takeaway, he was the one to say, "Let's just reheat one of your bowls. It's better for us." That little role reversal made her smile. There were still days when life tried to throw her off. A busy day of errands, a last-minute visit from friends, a bout of fatigue. But because she'd built her habits to be easy, she could stick with them. If she didn't have time for her full lunch prep, she could grab edamame from the freezer and a tub of cottage cheese. Still a strong, balanced meal. She stopped seeing these moments as failures and started seeing them as proof that her system worked. One quiet evening, after clearing the dinner table, Margaret looked out the kitchen window at the fading light. She thought about how far she'd come from that morning months ago when she struggled to carry groceries. Back then, she felt her strength slipping away and feared it was the inevitable path of aging. Now she felt steady, sure-footed, and more in control of her body than she had in years. And it wasn't because of one miracle food or a short burst of effort. It was because of the quiet, steady steps she took every day. She realized that the trick wasn't discipline, willpower, or even passion. The trick was simply showing up for herself every day in small, sustainable ways. And as long as she kept doing that, her muscles, her energy, and her independence would thank her for years to come. Margaret knew she had one final piece of her journey to embrace, living strong, mobile, and independent, and enjoying the life she had worked so hard to protect. The morning air was cool and fresh as Margaret stepped outside with Molly's leash in one hand and her shopping bag in the other. It was market day, one of her favorite days of the week. She walked down the front path with an ease she hadn't felt in years, her step steady and confident. A few months ago, she might have hesitated at the thought of carrying home a week's worth of groceries. Today, she knew she could do it, and she smiled at that thought. The changes had come gradually, so quietly at times that she only noticed them when she stopped to compare life now with life before. She no longer dreaded stairs. She could reach for items on the high shelf without feeling her arms strain. She could lift a heavy pot from the stove without that little flutter of uncertainty in her chest. These weren't just physical wins, they were symbols of the independence she had fought to protect. At the market, she moved from stall to stall with purpose, filling her bag with fresh vegetables, a dozen free-range eggs, a block of cottage cheese, a bag of lentils, and a neatly wrapped parcel of chicken breasts from the local poultry farmer. She picked up a bag of quinoa, smiled at its now familiar weight in her hand, and added it to her basket. The woman who once thought these foods were exotic or unnecessary now treated them as the foundation of her health. On the walk home, Margaret reflected on how different her days felt. The heaviness in her legs that had once made her dread long walks was gone. She no longer felt like her body was quietly betraying her. Instead, she felt supported by it, able to count on her own strength. It wasn't the kind of transformation you could see in a magazine before and after photo, but she knew it was far more valuable. Richard noticed it too. "You're quicker than me these days," he said one afternoon as they walked Molly through the park. Margaret laughed. "I've had good training," she replied. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just training, it was care. Day after day, meal after meal, choice after choice, she had been quietly rebuilding herself. Even Emily had commented on it. "Mum, you just seem lighter," she had said one weekend over tea. Margaret knew what she meant. It wasn't just about physical weight, it was about the ease that came from not constantly worrying if her body could keep up with her life. That weight had lifted, replaced by a quiet confidence. The biggest shift, though, was in how she thought about the future. Before, she had imagined her later years as a slow narrowing of possibilities. Less travel, fewer long walks, more caution in everyday life. Now she pictured something different. She saw herself exploring gardens in other cities, taking trips to the coast, kneeling to plant flowers without fearing she wouldn't be able to get back up. She imagined chasing her grandchildren through the park, laughing breathlessly, and still having the energy to help Emily prepare Sunday lunch afterward. One evening, as she stood at the kitchen counter preparing dinner, Margaret paused to take in the scene. The cutting board held vibrant red peppers, leafy spinach, and neatly sliced chicken. A pot of quinoa simmered quietly on the stove, filling the kitchen with a warm, nutty aroma. On the side was a small bowl of cottage cheese sprinkled with fresh herbs. It wasn't fancy food, it was everyday nourishment, but it was exactly what her body needed. She thought back to the frightened moment months ago when she struggled to carry groceries and wondered if this was simply getting old. Back then, she didn't know she could change the story. Now she knew better. Age would still bring changes, of course, but those changes didn't have to steal her independence. Not if she met them with knowledge, intention, and care. Her journey had started with fear. It had moved through learning, experimenting, and sometimes doubting. But it had ended, no, not ended, but transformed into a way of living that was sustainable, enjoyable, and deeply empowering. She wasn't chasing youth. She was investing in her strength for every year she had ahead. That night, as she and Richard shared a quiet dinner, Margaret felt a swell of gratitude. Gratitude for her body, for the foods that nourished it, for the people who had encouraged her along the way. But most of all, gratitude for the simple truth she had discovered, that small, consistent choices could change the way she experienced every single day. After dinner, she stepped outside with Molly one last time before bed. The street was quiet, the air cool against her face. She walked slowly down the path, her steps light but grounded. She knew she wasn't just walking the dog, she was walking into the next chapter of her life, strong, mobile, and independent. And for the first time in a long while, she knew that the future didn't feel like something to brace for. It felt like something to look forward to. Margaret's journey began quietly, just a few moments of unexpected weakness that she first dismissed as just getting older. But those small moments grew into a deeper concern, a worry that she might be losing the independence she cherished. She could have accepted it as inevitable. Instead, she chose to act. With curiosity and determination, she learned about sarcopenia, the silent loss of muscle with age, and discovered that the right foods could help her fight back. Her kitchen slowly transformed into her greatest ally. She welcomed chicken for its powerful, muscle-building protein. Quinoa and soy brought variety and plant-based strength. Lentils offered steady energy, and cottage cheese worked quietly through the night to support recovery. She refined not only what she ate, but how she cooked it, learning to protect nutrients and make every bite count. She combined